السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to a live program of Gems of the Heart, where we examine and we learn how to purify our hearts. Two things. We need to know what's in our hearts, but it's a very difficult thing. Our hearts is concealed. We do not see what's in our hearts. It's amazing how we as human beings, and sometimes we become very sophisticated, but we really don't know ourselves very well. We cannot really judge what's in our hearts in the pure and the most perfect way. And moreover, that we need to basically purify our hearts and to make it sound and to make it good, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching and seeing our hearts and our actions. As the Prophet ﷺ said in the authentic hadith, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنظُرُ إِلَى صُوَرِكُمْ وَلَا إِلَى أَجْسَامِكُمْ وَلَكِنْ يَنظُرُ إِلَى قُلُوبِكُمْ وَأَعْمَالِكُمْ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not look at your outside appearance and your bodies, but rather look at your hearts and your actions. So it doesn't matter whether a person is black or white or oriental or from this place or European or African or whatever there is, it doesn't matter. In the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're all humans, they're all from Adam alayhi salam. But what rather matters is what's in their hearts and their actions. That what makes a person righteous and good and believer and a great person and so on. And also the actions, what makes a person evil and wicked and so on and so forth. So what's in the hearts and what's in the physical appearance. And the heart is the foundation for anything that we say and we do. And that's why we have to make sure that we give attention to our hearts. We can deceive one another. We can do all kinds of tricks for people to think all kinds of good about us. But if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala know inside of us that we are evil and we are plotters and we do all kinds of evil things, that doesn't really benefit us to deceive people for a period of time. Eventually this will be exposed. Eventually this is something that will be bring all kinds of sorrow and regret for the person. So we have to really worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely, purely for the sake of Allah, with what's in our hearts, that it's all sincere for the sake of Allah. أَلَا لِلَّهِ الدِّينُ الْخَالِصِ. Indeed, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the pure religion. That means turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Do not associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore the knowledge of how to know what's in our hearts and how to purify our hearts is a mandatory knowledge. And there is nothing more important in our life than to purify our hearts. And the most important thing that purify the hearts is to get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Most High, the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Most Merciful, the Sustainer, the Protector, the Owner of all things. And how can we really benefit from this? Because these names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are not mentioned in the Quran for nothing or for no reason. It's mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ for us to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accordingly. And that's how the hearts become purified. And by knowing this, and whether a person knows what's in the hearts or not, but purifying our hearts with the names and attributes of Allah, with being obedient to Allah, with the good deeds and so on, that pushes away the evil and the filth and the bad things that if it's present in the heart, that will wash it away. Especially also that when we know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warned us from, and to take the means to purify our hearts from this, as we see the religion of Islam requires from us to work and to be serious in this life. This life is not a life of playing or being playful or following the desires. You know, people might deceive us this way. This life is a very serious one. We're not created for play. We're created to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And after this life, the matter is either Jannah or the hellfire. So it's a very serious one. And everybody shall return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And no matter how long we live on the face of earth, there's a moment will come. And everybody will die and everybody will return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what's the benefit of being forgetful? Nothing. It's actually, it's not just nothing. It's the worst thing for a person to let himself to be forgetful, to be ignorant, to follow their desires without being firm upon the belief and upon the truth. One of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we've been going through some of the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the knowledge of it is important, is essential, and it's something that affects our hearts and matters of belief and actions and so on, is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Walyy and Al-Mawla. Al-Walyy and Al-Mawla. And they both mean the protector. The protector, the helper, the one that helps the believers, the one that supports the believers. And this is something that brings all kinds of benefits and tranquility to the hearts of the believers. It has its real effect in their life and the real effect in their iman and their faith. And it's one of the names of Allah. And the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has attributes with it. It's not just names like human beings, they name themselves. And they might be far away from reality when it comes to the meanings of their name. So if someone is named Kareem or generous, but he can be the most, miser or the most greediest person on the face of earth. But the names to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are perfect names and attributes. So each name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has an attribute associated with it. And these attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is the like of it. So if you try to think of what is the meaning of the helper, the supporter, the ones gives victory and so on, if whoever think of it as a human being, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala beyond that. Nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wa huwa as-sami'ul basir, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said. So we need to know this name, and of course as a rule, these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for us to know them, we have to basically get this from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the only way for us to know the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when we look into the Quran and the word Al-Walyy, how it's mentioned in the Quran, as some had mentioned, and this is something mentioned in the Quran 14 times. 14 times in the Quran. Some of the names of Allah you would find only one verse about it, and some names, as we see, many verses in the Quran that talks about this. And it's very important that, of course, we will not be able to go through these verses and so on, all of them, but we need to understand this name, we need to believe in it, and we need to live our life according to this. Before we get into some of the verses that talks about the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Walyy and Al-Mawla, we need to really think of when the purpose of our life is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. When we know that the most important thing is the tawheed, the oneness of worship of Allah. And the worst thing is the opposite of that, what negates it, which is shirk, to associate partners with Allah. And when we know that at-tawheed, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one worthy of worship. What is the ruling of someone believing that other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can overpower Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This is of course kufr, disbelief. When we say la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, there's no might and there's no power except by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No one, as a matter of belief and as a matter of fact really, no one on the face of earth, no one whatsoever has any might and power that can oppose the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whatever power and might and intellectual abilities and so on that we have as human beings, who's the one that bestowed that upon us? Did we have it or did we create that for ourselves? Of course not. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of all things. وَاللَّهُ خَلَقَكُمْ وَمَا تَعْمَلُونَ. Allah created you and what you do also. So whatever means of power that you have, even if all human beings, they get together and they join their efforts, to do something, who's the one that gave them that ability? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will for them not to be able to fulfill what they want and what they intend, even though they have the means to it, they won't be able to do it. It's a matter of fact, it's a matter of belief. And this is basically something that we have to have the certainty and the iman and the faith to be upon this, because it has its implications in our life and actions and so on. And when the Prophet ﷺ, when he said to Abdullah ibn Abbas when he was a young boy about to reach the age of puberty, and he said to him the famous hadith, احفظ الله يحفظك, and so on, protect the orders of Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will protect you. He mentioned in the hadith, وَعْلَمْ, and have the knowledge, have the certainty, and لو اجتمعت الأمة, if the entire ummah, if the entire nation, the entire human beings, على أن ينفعوك بشيء, they all get together to try to benefit you with something. لم ينفعوك إلا بشيء كتبه الله عز وجل لك. They would not be able to benefit you with anything unless it's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained for you, wrote for you. So, and this is not exaggeration, this is something that we have to have the knowledge of it. So imagine the entire human being, they use all of their resources and their efforts and their power and their intellectual abilities and all of that to benefit you with anything, and something that means even if it's the smallest thing, even if it's to give you $1, even if to whatever there is. They won't be able to unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained for that to happen. And the opposite is the truth. If the entire humanity, they get together and they have nothing else to do in this life but to cause harm to you, you can imagine that person, how much certainty in his heart that he will be perished, he will be destroyed, finished. But the hadith says, if they all get together to do that, to cause harm to you, they won't be able to cause harm to you except if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will for it to happen. So what does that mean? It means that the heart should rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. The heart should fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And when it comes to seeking help and protection and so on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the protector. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Walyy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemned the disbelievers. What is the major differences between the believers and the disbelievers? One of which is that the disbelievers, they seek protection. They seek protectors other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why they take idols as worshippers or individuals or whatever there is, they associate partners with Allah. وَاتَّخَذُوا مِن دُونِهِ أَوْلِيَاءَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that about the disbelievers. They took besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala awliya, helpers, protectors, supporters. فَاللَّهُ هُوَ الْوَلِيُّ. See the ayah, how powerful it is. فَاللَّهُ هُوَ الْوَلِيُّ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Walyy. The verse started with the disbelievers. They take besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala awliya, many helpers and supporters and so on. Then the ayah states it very clearly. فَاللَّهُ هُوَ الْوَلِيُّ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the wali, is the protector, is the helper. وَهُوَ يُحْيِي الْمَوْتَ وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. And He is the one that gives life after death, and He is the one that is able to do all things. So that means what? The believers, they should be different than the disbelievers. The believers, who is their wali? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who is their protector? Who is their helper? It should not be just some words that a person say, but rather this is a belief, this is actions. Because what does that implies also in our actions? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the protector, that means who's the one that we would have the absolute obedience to? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because He's the protector. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders you, to do something, and the human beings or a human being or whatever, they tell you not to do that same thing, right? Who would the person have his heart attached to? Definitely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The matter is very obvious and very clear. But if other than Allah threatens you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the protector. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our protector. There is no way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will order the believers to do something and it's bad for them or harmful for them or it would ruin their life, right? And if a person would say, but we know that at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and at all times this is something very clear, people receive harm, they get harmed by the disbelievers, or the Prophet ﷺ, when they fought against the disbelievers, they came to take them outside of the fold of Islam, and so on. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the martyrs and so on. The point here is, at the end, what is the ultimate goal of the believers? To stay in the state of belief, to be upon the belief, and to be in the state of belief till the last moment of their life. And the last moment of their life will be the most joyful one for them, if they were believers and steadfast on the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is فَاللَّهُ الْوَلِيُّ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the protector. This is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that also clearly, that who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the helper to who? Allahu waliyyu ladhina amanu. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the wali, is the protector of the believers. And that has so many different ways and forms and so on. What's the most important of it? يخرجهم من الظلمات إلى النور. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the protector of the believers. People might think, okay, does that mean that the believers will have the most of the wealth on the face of earth? They will be physically the strongest people on the face of earth? This is not necessarily what it means. Because all of these things in this life goes away by the end of the life of the person. This is not the purpose of our life. But the real protection and the real help is when the person is upon the truth and is protected from being upon falsehood and so on. That's why the ayah says, Allahu waliyyu ladhina amanu. And wait to hear what basically the affairs of the disbelievers. Allahu waliyyu ladhina amanu. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the wali, the protector of the believers. يخرجهم من الظلمات إلى النور. He takes them out from the dhulumat, from the darknesses to the light. The darknesses of kufr, disbelief, the darknesses of associating partners with Allah, the darknesses of bid'ah, innovations in the deen, the darknesses of sins, many darknesses, to an-nur, the one light, which is the message of the Prophet ﷺ. And then on the other hand, وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا, and as for the disbelievers, أَوْلِيَاؤُهُمُ الطَّاغُوتِ يُخْرِجُونَهُم مِّنَ النُّورِ إِلَى الظُّلُمَاتِ. As for the disbelievers, the awliya'uhum, their awliya, plural, many awliya, many helpers for the disbelievers. But what is it? At-taghut. At-taghut, anything that is worshipped besides Allah, followed, obeyed, and so on. But they take them out of the light to the darknesses. So they might have some benefits in this life, but they're basically taking them away from the light, from the truth, to the falsehood. أُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. They are the dwellers of the hellfire, and they will be in it forever. So you see the benefit of the wilayah and the help and the protection from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to be upon faith, is to be among the believers, is to continue to be among those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows His favor upon. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He mentioned this help and protection, and in the context of the verses of the struggle of the believers with the disbelievers, and the disbelievers, they do all kinds of things, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the supporter and helpers of the believers, as all of the names and attributes of Allah, as of everything that is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala suffice for the believers. So when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the helper for the believers, but it's okay to seek help from other than Allah, this is false. This is wrong. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sufficient for the believers when it comes to the help. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَفَى بِاللَّهِ وَلِيًّا. That is sufficient is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a wali, as a helper for the believers. After Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ بِأَعْدَائِكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best your enemies. So who you fear, or what is the subject that comes in mind when we talk about Al-Walyy or Al-Mawla, the protector, the helper? That means there is some harm might happen, so you want to have protection, you want to have help, right? So one of which is from your enemies. And your enemies, they are plotting and they're spending their wealth and they're doing all kinds of things. So who's the one that is protecting you or will protect you? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He knows best your enemies. So if you want to know your enemies, go back to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ will explain to you your enemies. So even if your enemies are trying to deceive you and they're trying to say to you that we are your friends, but if they're explained in the Quran that they are your enemies, so they are your enemies. And how to deal with them, of course, is according also to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And again, وَكَفَى بِاللَّهِ وَلِيًّا. Sufficient is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for you as the wali and the protector and the helper and so on. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always, as we heard, is the wali of the believers, and He subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that would support them and help them and give them victory and so on. And also when it comes to the affairs of the people, you know, who's the one that would take care of the affairs of the people, the believers? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, and if someone that needs the help, we need the help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every step we take. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will, He can deviate us all. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will, we won't be able to fulfill anything in this life. So what matters is if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be the one that runs the affairs of the person, helps the person to be upon the truth, and help the person to be steadfast. And we have many examples of this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that in the battle of Badr, for example, that how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the believers face the disbelievers, and they were so much outnumbered by the disbelievers, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave victory to the Prophet ﷺ, and gave victory to the Prophet ﷺ and the companions radiallahu anhum. And when they are faced with their enemies and the disbelievers, you know, they said something because their hearts are attached to their idols and their images that they worship besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when one of the disbelievers, he said, لَنَا الْعُزَّى وَلَا عُزَّى لَكُمْ. He said, we have Al-Uzza. Al-Uzza is an idol that they used to worship. And he said to the believers, وَلَا عُزَّى لَكُمْ. You don't have a Uzza, that means you don't have protection. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said to the companions radiallahu anhum, أَلَا تُجِبُوا. Shouldn't you respond to what he's saying? And this before the battle started. This is before the fight erupted. And the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they said, what should we say to him, O Prophet of Allah? He said, قُولُوا اللَّهُ مَوْلَانَا وَلَا مَوْلَى لَكُمْ. Say that Allah is Mawlana. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our protector. And you have no Mawla. you have no protector for you. So the believers, they said that clearly. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Mawla of the believers. And the disbelievers, there is no Mawla lahum, there is no protector or helper for them whatsoever, because these awliya, these idols that they worship besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, their wilayah, their protection and helping does not exist to start with. It's not like it's there but it's small, it's minimal. It does not exist to start with. So someone having this false belief that idols will help them, that images of prophets will help them, that people dead in the grave would help them, things of that nature, this has no reality to it. It's a lie, it's a falsehood. So therefore, it's nothing, it's upon nothing. And therefore the people will see that in the Day of Judgment as they were nothing, and they were basically falling into the disbelief and taking themselves to the hellfire, wal-'iyadhu billah. And for the believers, this is the reality of things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is their protector. And the ways that life is governed on the face of earth is not according to what we desire. It's all by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the wisdom behind everything that happens. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He will, He can give you help against the disbelievers, meaning to make you superior immediately. وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَانْتَصَرَ مِنْهُمْ. That means if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will, that He would give you victory over them. But then what is the purpose of this? وَلَكِنْ لِيَبْلُوَ بَعْضَكُمْ بِبَعْضٍ. To test you one another, towards one another. So life is a test, life is a struggle. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the protector for the believers, and as we heard, the real protection is for them to be steadfast upon the truth, and to be upon the truth, and to continue to be upon the truth, and to continue till the last moment of one's life. When it comes to effect of that in our life, that's as long as the purpose of one's life is being fulfilled, that's the victorious one. That is the one that is really helped. So that's why people, when they, from a distance, they might look at this and they would say, what does that means when in many cases, for example, the believers are defeated physically by the disbelievers or whatever there is, right? Because they don't understand the reality of this life. The believers, that they're upon matters of belief and obedient to Allah and so on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them victory and testing them and elevating their levels in this life, and eventually the end will be for the believers, no doubt, if they are upon al-Iman and they are not committing sins and repenting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But also with the ways that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created things on the face of earth is the protection from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the believers to fulfill the purpose of their life. If someone dies as a martyr and he receives the honor and dignity from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's the ultimate victory for them. To die, and when they die, they receive the rewards from Allah. So what matters is for the person to receive the help and the support from Allah, to be steadfast on the deen of Allah, and that's basically the outcome and the benefit of Al-Walyy or Al-Mawla, the protector, the helper. More of this meaning, inshallah ta'ala, and others after the break. So stay with us, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Welcome back, and we're talking about the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Walyy and Al-Mawla, the protector, the helper, the guardian, the one that guards the believers, to keep them steadfast and to help them and to give them victory and to support them. And that's something that should be well established in the hearts of the believers if they understand the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the clear examples that shows how that a person can face all kinds of trials in their life, and still Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is their protectors, and there's no contradiction here. Yusuf alayhi salam, one of the prophets of Allah, he went through all kinds of struggles in his life, and he went through all kinds of difficulties. He was thrown in a well when he was young by his own brothers, and he was separated from his father and mother for many, many years, till he grew up and he was in charge of Egypt and so on. So this is a real struggle, and he was thrown into the prison for years. Someone would look at a life like this, he would see that where is the protection here? Where is the help here? He was helped from the very beginning, and that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the surah. He was helped in being prepared to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from him, and the patience and the help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that all of the things that happened in his life was made in such a way to lead him to whatever position he was in afterwards. and he was well established afterwards, and establishing the truth and so on. And this is the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth. But after all of this, the same thing when we look into Musa alayhi salam. But before we get into this, how Yusuf alayhi salam at the end of Surah Yusuf, when he was well established and now his parents and his brothers that are there with him, and he was, after the long story, and he becomes superior and so on, and the fulfillment of his dream happened as he said to his father and so on. And then he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, showing that how he's grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon him. رَبِّ قَدْ آتَيْتَنِي مِنَ الْمُلْكِ وَعَلَّمْتَنِي تَأْوِيلَ الْأَحَادِيثِ فَاطِرَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ أَنْتَ وَلِيِّي فِي الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. He said that word, أَنْتَ وَلِيِّي فِي الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ توفني مسلما وألحقني بالصالحين. Which means he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, saying that, oh Allah, you gave me al-mulk, the kingdom, the sovereignty, and you made me learn the interpretation of the dreams and the hadith, and the creator of the heavens and the earth. فَاطِرَ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. You are the creator of the heavens and the earth. أَنْتَ وَلِيِّي فِي الدُّنْيا وَالْآخِرَةِ. You are my wali in the dunya and the hereafter. So this is to show that with the life of Yusuf alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is his wali, and that's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided him and aided him all along on all of these different tests and trials to be in whatever position that he was in. توفني مسلما وألحقني بالصالحين. That's the ultimate objective of being the protector of the believers. The believers, what is the ultimate objective in this life? توفني مسلما وألحقني بالصالحين. Make me die as a Muslim and make me be joining in the company of the righteous ones. That's Yusuf alayhi salam. After all of what he faced and so on, this is his wish, this is his dream, this is what he wants to be, and that is to die as a Muslim and to be among the righteous ones. If this ultimate goal in our life is very vivid and very clear in our hearts, then everything will fall in place. What really matters is to die as a Muslim and to be joined with the Salihin, with the righteous ones. To be among the Salihin and the righteous ones in this life, and to be with them in the hereafter. And to die as a Muslim. So if a person is upon this, he would see the help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all along throughout his life, to be guided, to see the truth, to be upon the truth, to be away from sins and disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and kufr and shirk and the like of this and so on. The same thing when we see, for example, Musa alayhi salam, how that before he was given the prophethood, right, before that, and it's mentioned in the Quran, how he went through all kinds of struggle. From the moment that he was born and he was cast in a river to protect him from Fir'aun, that he was going around to take the newly born children from Bani Israel, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected him from them. And from that instant, and he brought him back to his mother and so on. And then growing up, alayhi salam, and fleeing from his town, and then going to a strange place, and being a worker for 10 years as a dowry for his wife, and then returning after he received the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's a life of struggle. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed his favor upon Musa alayhi salam and made him one of the Ulil Azmi min Rusul, one of the best of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we know the life of Musa alayhi salam. But it's a life of struggle. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the helper of Musa alayhi salam, of course. And he continued to be Prophet of Allah, steadfast on the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comforted the believers. As he said subhanahu wa ta'ala, أَلَا إِنَّ أَوْلِيَاءَ اللَّهِ لَخَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَهُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. That indeed awliya Allah, the awliya of Allah, those who are the closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who protect the orders of Allah, those who give victory to the orders of Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is their protector. And there's no fear for them, nor shall they grieve. Who are these people? الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ. Those who believe and they have the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're the ones there's no fear for them, nor shall they grieve. And therefore this is the concern, again as we said, to the believers. When we also see the last verses in Surah Al-Baqarah, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in these verses, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. And when we look at these verses, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed his favors upon the believers. And the believers, they would say in their words, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا. Making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to relieve themselves from being in state of forgetfulness or mistakes. ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا, and all of that is granted. Do not make us among those who bear harsh or harm and difficulties as it happened to the nations before. ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به. Oh Allah, do not make us bear what we don't have the capacity to do. واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا. Pardon us, forgive us, have mercy upon us. And then how the verse ended, أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. You are مولانا, you are مولانا, you are the Mawla, you are the protector. فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. And therefore, when we look into this ayah, how it's ended, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made these two verses, as the Prophet ﷺ said, these are two verses that from the treasures of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, came from under the arsh of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How it ends, Anta Mawlana, you are our Mawla. So are we living our life according to this meaning? That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our protector. He's the one that is protecting us. He's the one that is supporting us. He's the one that is the most merciful subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore we need to be truthful with ourselves when it comes to this name and attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How to achieve this in our life? How can we have this in our life? Because it's all based on what we do and what we believe. It's not because my name is this or your name is this, or you're born from righteous parents, or you lived in this place or that place. It's nothing of this. It's according to our belief and actions. So how can we have this protection from Allah? How can we be among those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows His favor upon, and to protect them and to guard them and to make them believers and to protect them from all harms and so on? As the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّهُ لَا يُنَالُ مَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ إِلَّا بِطَاعَتِهِ. If you want to receive and attain something from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is never to be attained except by the obedience of Allah. As we heard in the verse, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ. Who are the ones that receive the protection from Allah? The believers, those who have belief and they have the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the matter is not just words to be said. It's not just things that has no reality to it. We have to be patient to be upon what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. If we really want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us as a nation, as a ummah, and as individuals, we need to be upon what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. If we seek the pleasure of Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be with us. As the hadith, as we heard it before, احفظ الله يحفظك. If you want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect you, protect the orders of Allah. Fulfill the orders of Allah. Never think that for you to be obedient to Allah, you will subject yourself to harm. This is basically having su' dhan, thinking bad about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered you to do something, and He will bring harm to you if you fulfill the orders of Allah that He ordered you. That's bad thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is evil to think this way. But rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He ordered us to do certain things, and we should fulfill the orders of Allah. And sometimes it comes into very small things, but the roots of it is in the heart. When it's time for the salah, and a person is buying and selling, he is relaxing, wants to be lazy and sleep, or whatever there is. What is more valuable, what is more important, what is more benefiting than fulfilling the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Whatever that thing that you would leave the orders of Allah for, it would never be benefiting for you. We should always remember that Allah is the helper. Allah is our guardian. Allah is subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives us victory and help. So fulfill the orders of Allah. You're concerned about your health, Allah will give you health. Of course, unless it's a situation where a person is sick, that's a different situation with the rulings of praying, for example, at home if a person is sick and things of that nature. Talking about people, for example, a person is lazy. So whatever rest and relaxation and goodness that you're seeking for yourself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you fulfill His orders, He will reward you. He will give you a better life. He would never make you regret what you did if you're obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A person wants to fulfill his desire in a sinful way, desire that is overpowering the person. Leave it for the sake of Allah. You lose, you would never lose. you will gain much, much more than what you missed of a temporary enjoyment that would the end up, or the end result of it, or the outcome of it will be disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we live our life according to this intention, according to this attitude, things will totally change in our life. We would see the guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the help. And there's a level of sacrifice that we have to put into this, in which we learn the deen of Allah. Sacrifice to learn the truth. Sacrifice to be upon the truth. And whoever said that we will be able to do whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to do without being tested, that's against the way of life. أَحَسِبَ النَّاسُ أَن يُتْرَكُوا أَن يَقُولُوا آمَنَّا وَهُمْ لَا يُفْتَنُونَ. Do people think that they will be left to say we believe and they're not going to be tried and tested in this life? It doesn't work this way. And the verses goes on with this meaning. So the point here is relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Focusing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that helps us, is the one that gives us victory, is the one that is watching us, and He's the most merciful, and He's the most high subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the matter is by what the end of it is. So being firm, being upon the belief, being upon the obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that how we bring the support and the help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whenever we see this characteristics or this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioned in the Quran, who received this? The believers. So our focus is to fulfill that characteristics, what we need to be upon. Allahu waliyyu alladhina amanu. I want to be among alladhina amanu, to be among the believers. So, and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Mawla alladhina amanu, He is the Mawla, He is the protector and guardian and the helper of alladhina amanu. So the concern that we have, I want to be among alladhina amanu. How to be among alladhina amanu? This is in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to fulfill al-iman with matters of belief, to fulfill the orders of Allah, to establish the salah, to pray even the recommended salah, to pray at night and make dua and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to fulfill the rights of others, to give charity, not to cheat, not to basically steal, even to the extent of which, some people are given blessings in this life for a reason. And there's a hadith, and it's an authentic hadith. The meaning of it is that among the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, among the believers are people, inna Allah, that means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inna li'aqwamin ni'aman, that there's some people they have favors. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala aqarrahum indahum, that means aqarraha indahum, that among the people that are favors, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made these favors with them and it's well established with them. For what reason? Because they are benefiting to others. Meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives someone wealth. For what reason? Because he's helping others. He's generous. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him wealth. As long as they are generous to people. But once they start being greedy, once they start being with unease with these poor people, this favor can be taken away from them. This is an unseen matter that people don't see. They think it's because of their effort, they have money. They think that this is because of they're smarter than others, they have fortune and so on. This is not the case. This is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if a person sees himself being protected from being sinful, if a person sees himself being helped to be in the service of others, this is a great favor that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is guarding him, that Allah is protecting him, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is helping him. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives this worldly materialistic matters to everybody, the believers and the disbelievers. But He gives the deen, the religion, the righteousness to the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the reality of this and to make us among those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love and protect and help, and to make us worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accordingly, to be among the believers, those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestow upon them His help and victory, and to give victory to the ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So till next time, I leave you with the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.